let's give him a surprise. And Hal woke up rubbing his disbelieving eyes. He saw the guns aimed down at the bay, said, pack it up, lads, time to sail away. 'Cause the storm rolled in and the clock ran out, and the British knew without a doubt it's evacuation day, March 17. They sailed away, a crescent fleet on the open sea, leaving Boston town finally free. Oh, raise your voice and shout hooray, evacuation day.
Dave Bowman with us for the day, and in this 8 o'clock hour of a Tuesday, it is Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live. Headline at BillMick.com is Jeopardizing Freedom. There you'll see a couple of links to Dave Does History and the like. You can link those podcasts up there at the top of the page on the iHeartRadio app and be ready to jump in with Dave every day, just like you do with WMMB, our Bill Mick Live and Florida Roundtable podcast. We're going to be talking to the Florida legislature this weekend on the Roundtable with political scientist Chris Muro, so make sure you catch up with that over the weekend here on WMMB. But Dave, it's time for us to turn to Dave Does History. What are we looking at this morning, sir?
It has been almost a year since the shots were fired that April morning in Lexington, a little bit later that morning in Concord. And in that ensuing year, we have talked about all these things happening, but one of the things that sometimes we sort of miss is that we chased the British all the way back to Boston after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And since the evening of April 19th, 1775, all the way to today, March 17th, 1776, 250 years ago today, the British have been holed up in Boston, completely surrounded by, at first, the colonial militias, later what will become the Continental Army. This is one of those militarily bizarre things, Bill, because this should not have worked. This, at one point, Washington, who's placed in command in June, is down to about 4,000 men who are actually combat ready, surrounding these 11,000 British troops in Boston. The advantage is, of course, that we control most of the high ground. There is one spot, known as Dorchester Heights, that no one has decided to occupy. Now, here's the really stupid thing about this. The British generals, Howe, Clinton, they recognize the fact that Dorchester Heights should be occupied. Their officers are writing in their notebooks and their journals, yeah, tomorrow we're going to occupy the Dorchester Heights, keep the rebels off of there. Washington knows that Dorchester Heights should be occupied. We need to do this. We need to get around to this. But it's like they just all sit there and go, well, we need to do this, but ... whatever excuse you want to insert today. We don't have the manpower. We don't have whatever we need. And the British are just content to go, well, as long as the rebels don't try to occupy it, we'll just leave it alone. Now, Dorchester Heights, for those of you who may not be familiar with Boston, you've got the harbor there. Dorchester Heights kind of sits on the southern end of that harbor, and it overwatches the entrance to the harbor. It's a very strategic position, but it's this position that just sort of gets ignored. And for this entire year, that goes on, Bill. It just, militarily, I can't explain it. Nobody can.
So let me throw a quick question here, Dave. It's almost like a hostage situation where the Brits are in Boston. Are supplies coming in, going out as they need to?
No, that's what we've been talking about. The British are being starved out because our privateer Navy is keeping that. Plus, they're trying to ship stuff across the ocean in the dead of winter. It's not working. These 11,000 British troops in Boston are starving. Sure, they're having plays like we've talked about, and they're entertained, but this is not a good, tenable strategic situation. And even General Howe realizes this. He starts to think, maybe we should evacuate Boston. He writes to London in October saying, I think we're going to need to abandon Boston. And then does nothing. He just sits there and goes, well, I guess I'll just wait for them to decide what we're going to do. He makes no plan, nothing. It's a remarkable thing because George Washington this whole time keeps writing in his journal. He keeps having meetings. We need to attack. We need to charge into Boston. Now, remember, he only has about 4,000 men available. The British have over 11,000. But he keeps thinking to himself, no, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. And in early March of 1776, he actually has a conference with all his leading officers. And they all look at him and go, well, you know, George, that sounds really good on paper, but it ain't gonna work.
And we pick it up in 60 seconds here with Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live. Glad you're along with us on this Tuesday morning. Back into Dave Does History. So Washington's senior folks convince him not a good idea to go in here. So what ends up happening, Dave?
Well, you need to understand, Washington's not happy about this. He thinks, as so many people in war do, that the glory is in the fight. But Washington, he's not the Washington that we know and love yet, but he's learning. And this is going to be one of the most important lessons he's going to learn. If you have subordinates, you probably should listen to them, as the caller last hour was talking about.
Yeah.
The strategic situation in Boston is so tenuous for the British. But the Americans, for whatever reason, they know this. They're getting daily reports. There are actually patriots living in Boston. Several of them are elected officials in Boston. The British have forbidden them to leave the city, even though they're patriots. You can't leave because you're part of the city government. And basically, every day they're sending a message to Washington and the patriots saying, okay, this is the situation now. The weird part is that the British have almost no intelligence whatsoever about the Americans. They don't know how many there are. They don't know why they're doing things or why they're not doing things. And they certainly don't know. They assume that militarily the Americans are just incompetent because they have not occupied Dorchester Heights. Because every general worth anything knows that's the key position. And it sort of becomes like their policy towards the colony of solitary neglect, which is that as long as the rebels don't try to take those hills, we're not going to expend the effort to do that. So the two hills, Bunker Hill is still in the British hands, Dorchester Heights, that's where we're at. Washington knows that if he can get to Dorchester Heights with artillery, see, just putting men up there isn't going to do any good, but if he had some guns, he could dominate the harbor and the British wouldn't be able to stay there. But he doesn't have any guns yet, ... But if you will recall a few weeks ago, Henry Knox has now arrived with these guns. 58 of them, as a matter of fact, the noble train of artillery that came from Fort Ticonderoga. We talked about that whole trip that he made across there. Now these guns are here. What do we do with them? Well, the obvious answer is we put them up on Dorchester Heights, because Dorchester Heights is the key to this entire thing. But how do you get them there? These are very heavy guns, Bill. This is a lot of work. By some estimates, it would take 20,000 men at least a week to emplace these guns up on top of Dorchester Heights. It's one of the reasons the British don't think they can do it. Mm-hmm. But if they can, then the guns would cover the harbor. The ships, the British ships that are in the harbor, can't elevate their guns high enough to actually shoot at Dorchester Heights. So they can't even counter battery fire the guns up there if they could get them up there. But we can't figure out how to do this. Well, this is where Washington begins to learn that it goes back to the thing I said last week or 2 weeks ago about So many people believe, oh, it was just a couple of guys that did something. Oh, no. We've got a guy who's related to Israel Putnam. He's an engineer. And, of course, Henry Knox is an engineer. And they come up with a brilliant plan, Bill. They build, the ground is too frozen to actually dig into. So you've got to get these guns to the top of this hill. You've got to emplace them, and you have to protect them. How do we do that? Well, these guys set the mind, and they start reading, because that's what you do, and they actually find an old British text, war text, from probably 100 years before, and they come across an idea in this British text about how to protect troops doing this kind of operation. And essentially what they do, there's a little land bridge that goes from the American lines to Dorchester Heights, and they're going to build what is, for all practical purposes, a tunnel out of hay bales so that the British, A, can't see them going across the land bridge, and B, even if they could see them, there's nothing they could do about it. But even with that, we want to make sure that this becomes a surprise. And so, beginning on March 2nd, 1776, Washington, his troops, Putnam, the other generals, Knox, they begin this operation. What they start doing is they start using their other cannons that they have. There's not a lot of them, but they start using them. And they start shelling Boston, just at random. They just start shelling Boston, just to get the British attention away from Dorchester Heights.
We'll see how it works out as we continue. Dave Does History in moments here on WMMB.
This is Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live.
And when we last left Dave, General Washington trying to figure out how to get the guns to Dorchester Heights, and they started an operation to establish that position, and in the process of doing so, keep it hidden from the British while they did it. A little difficult to do, but Dave, how'd they make this thing happen, man?
It's difficult to do, but it shouldn't be. The British should be paying attention to this, but they're just... there's a level of presumption here on the part of the British that is basically, well, it's just like General Burgoyne's play. They just believe that Washington and the rebels are just a bunch of country bumpkins who don't know nothing, can't figure anything out. What they keep forgetting is that we trained some of their people, Henry Knox, Israel Putnam, and the nephew of Israel Putnam, Rufus Putnam, who was a brilliant engineer who discovered this plan that the British had, and we used it against them. He builds these things called chandeliers, which are just timber frameworks that they climb to the top of the hill, they put them up on the hill, and then they fill them with dirt and stones and all kinds of stuff. They fill a bunch of barrels with rocks. They take those up to the top so that as the British come charging up the hill, they just roll these barrels down. So we're not going to have a repeat of Bunker Hill, that if we run out of ammunition, we don't have anything left to fight with. They've got this whole thing planned. And on the night of March 4th, 1776, under the cover of darkness, they start moving all this stuff up Dorchester Heights. And they do it with that other bombardment going on. So the attention is being drawn elsewhere. In fact, we're told by many of the historians that the British seem to relish this artillery duel where they just start shooting back at the other artillery. They're paying no attention whatsoever to Dorchester Heights. Even when people come in and say, hey, there's men on Dorchester Heights, maybe we should do something, General Howe's attitude is kind of like, it's not important, don't worry about it. And so they don't. And over the course of the night of March 4th and March 5th, the Americans managed to haul 58 of those Knox cannons to the top of that hill, embed them there using ox carts, soldiers to drag them up. They build an instant fortress using hay bales and timbers to create those defensive works. And by early morning, this hill, which had been completely empty, now all of a sudden is a fortress with 58 cannons pointing down at the British that they can do nothing about. The ships can't elevate their guns high enough. They don't have any mortars. They don't have any land-based artillery that can elevate enough to get to this thing. Where these fortifications are, there was nothing there before. And even General Howe is just astonished by this when he gets up in the morning, realizes what has happened. He makes a comment about the fact that he couldn't get an army of 20,000 men to do this in 3 weeks. And the Americans have done it overnight. Do you understand why that's so important? Overnight, this rabble of the Continental Army has basically trapped the strongest Navy and Army on the entire planet and said, now what are you going to do?
And we find out in 60 seconds on WMMB. So, Dave, what you're telling me is that in a situation here, the Patriots acted beyond their believed capability and actually created a huge surprise for the British that they could not have anticipated.
The British were just stunned. An expedition equal to that of the genie belonging to Aladdin's wonderful lamp, one of them will write. They just cannot believe that this has been done. And by the way, Washington chose the date, the evening of March 4th into March 5th, on purpose. Anybody remember why? What is March 5th? What is that date? Oh, yeah, the Boston Massacre 5 years before.
Oh.
And Washington makes a point of reminding them that they are avenging those losses on that day. This is so full of symbolism and so full of everything. But the British, of course, well, they're still the British, Bill. They're still the old saying, to be a champion, you have to beat a champion. Mm-hmm. And the British have planned for this response. The plan has always been, if the Americans occupy Dorchester Heights, we'll just send some troops over there and scatter them. 2,400 British troops load up into boats, and they began to push their way across the harbor. Now, there are many British officers who wrote in their journals, wrote letters saying, this is a really bad idea. Does Howe not remember what happened at Bunker Hill? And if you think the Americans are going to make the same mistake they made at Bunker Hill, which is running out of ammunition again, well, as we already talked about, the Americans have planned for that. They literally have barrels filled with stones that they're going to roll down the hill at these. This is the 1700s, folks. You remember how people line up to march and stuff? This isn't, this is the British way of war. These barrels full of rocks are going to come ripping through your lines before the Americans even open fire.
Bowling for British. I like it.
It's fantastic. These officers are saying, this is a really bad idea. We don't want to do this. This is insane. We're trapped. We need to get out of here. But Howe, British officer, realizes that he has to, stiff upper lip and all that nonsense. He has to carry out all this British pride and stuff. And so he sends these 2,400 men across the harbor to attack Dorchester Heights. Seems like it should be a battle you would remember, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is what I was saying a few weeks ago when I was talking about, I'm not a big believer in the supernatural and all those kinds of things, but if you're the British, and every time you have a plan to do something, something weird happens, don't you kind of at some point say, well, the gods must be against us?
Sure.
And unlike Agamemnon, we don't have a daughter to sacrifice. We don't, the king king's 3,000 miles and 6 months away. At some point, don't you just start saying, well, there's too much happening against us. Maybe we should reconsider all this. We are told that one of the most violent storms in the history of Boston hits while these British troops are trying to cross. And, of course, it completely annihilates the British attack without the Americans ever firing a shot. Never even get out of the boats. They get driven back to shore. And there's a lot of relief, actually, on the British soldiers' parts. They're kind of like, whew, God saved us.
Yeah.
And General Howe begins to realize this is, I don't have any instructions from London, but we're going to call a council of war because we need to decide what we're going to do, which should be pretty obvious even to General Howe.
And we will pick that up and take your calls at 321-768-1240 as we continue in moments with Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live right here on WMMB.
Call Bill now, 321-768-1240.
Chance for you to weigh in with Dave Bowman as Dave wraps up Dave Does History on this Tuesday morning. Thanks for spending your time with us today on 92.7 FM WMMB. So, Dave, the Patriots take up an advantageous position. The Brits have no way to fight it. The gods turn against them and the weather turns them back. So General Howe is saying what now? I got to turn you on. There you are. There you go. Okay, go ahead.
Try lingerie. Isn't that amazing the way that this whole thing seemed to work out? And really it all comes down to Washington's willingness to listen to other people and to accept their advice. General Howe he's stuck. I mean, he convenes this council of war, but it's not so much a council of war as a council of, okay, what's the plan for getting out of here? Because these guns, these 58 guns up on Dorchester Heights, not only can they essentially close the harbor, so even if our supply ships get past all the privateers, get past all the bad weather, now they got to run these guns to try to bring in food to Boston. They're not going to make it. Oh, and the ships that are already here, they could very easily be hit by these American guns. The supplies are running low. They don't have food. We can't hold Boston. So they make a decision that the British will leave. Now, they do something here that's kind of interesting. You'll notice that we haven't talked about the Americans just hell-mel blowing stuff up yet, right? General Howe sends a delegation of elected elected Boston officials under a white flag to meet with Washington. They carry with them a completely unsigned letter because General Howe is not an idiot, so he never signs the letter that basically says, look, you got us. We're going to leave, and as long as you don't shoot at us, we won't burn the town to the ground. And Washington kind of scratches his chin and says, okay, I agree to this. And, of course, none of this is signed. None of this is formal. None of this is in writing. It's just sort of an unspoken, tacit truce that they're going to have. But the British have to figure out how they're going to get this done. They've got 9,000 troops, 1,200 military dependents, and there's 1,100 loyalists all living in Boston that they've got to figure out how they're going to get out of here. These 1,100 loyalists, by the way, they're people who have lived in Boston most of their lives. This is their ancestral homes. This is their property. Mm-hmm. And they're going to have to evacuate and make a decision. Do we leave or do we stay and face the Patriots? Because that's probably not going to go well either if we do. Over the next few days, Boston literally descends into just utter chaos. Carts, trucks, wheelbarrows, hand barrows, coaches, driving as if the very devil is after them, said John Rowe, who was a Boston merchant. The city tears itself apart. The soldiers are just seizing anything they can get that's worthwhile. But in the meantime, they're dumping stuff that is supposedly worthwhile, but they don't want the Patriots to have. They're going to sink sugar and salt. They just throw it in the harbor. They throw their guns, the guns that they do have, they spike them and throw them into the harbor where they can't be used. Tables, chairs, furniture, artwork, you name it, it just gets thrown, including, by the way, General Howe has this really nice coach, elegant coach, that British aristocracy rides around in. Mm-hmm. That thing is busted up and thrown into the harbor so that the rebels won't get it because, we don't want them to have this, right? And the problem, of course, is that there's still too much stuff. There's still too many people. There's still not enough ships. We got to get all this stuff out of there. And so they work this plan to pack as much stuff as they can. But it's all dependent on, whether the Americans will allow them to do it or not. On the morning of March 17th, 1776, 250 years ago today, almost right now, well, Pacific time anyway, a little bit after that, your guys' time, the British begin to march silently down to the wharves. And we are told by those who were there that this was the most silent march they had ever experienced. Not a word was spoken by any of the soldiers as they, in a way, humiliated, marched down to the wharves to get onto the ships to sail out. The Americans, of course, are watching from up on Dorchester Heights, and there's this eerie calm over the whole thing. The soldiers board the ships, the loyalists and the dependents board the ships, and they weigh anchor, and they begin to pull out of the harbor. And as they pull past the castle, which is Castle William, which is the headquarters of the British Army, a 50-gun salute is sounded from the castle. And then they're gone. They sail out of the harbor. They actually sail down to Rhode Island because of the prevailing winds, but they're out. They're gone. They're no longer in Boston. And there's almost this sense of, wait, we won? There's almost this inability of the Americans to believe this. We enjoyed the unspeakable satisfaction of beholding their entire fleet under sail, wafting from our shores. The dreadful scourge of war was leaving. Now, Washington, he doesn't just go charging into Boston because he don't trust the British. He sends 500 men that are specifically handpicked. These 500 men are picked for this very reason, that they had smallpox and survived. So they are immune to smallpox. So he sends them in first to see that everything is safe. They discover some amazing things, Bill. One of the things they discover is that all those troops that are up on Bunker Hill are just scarecrows dressed in British uniforms. The British never even said truth. They're just dummies, stuffed dummies up there. They discover that there's all kinds of mess. There's all kinds of destruction, but the British have managed to leave behind, even though they destroyed everything, 29 guns, 3,000 cannonballs, 5,000 bushels of wheat, and, oh, by the way, John Hancock, who's from Boston, his personal house, it's a little messy, but it has not been damaged in any way, shape, or form. The British, God bless them, have taken care of that, and they've been very nice about, making sure that these things don't get torn up. This day proves several things. It proves that the Continental Army, with solid leadership from Washington and his staff, can defeat the British strategically. That Washington, and remember, at this point, Washington is kind of an unknown in the sense of military leadership. There's a lot of debate in Congress of whether or not it should have been Washington or Benedict Arnold or someone else in charge. But this has proven that Washington's leadership is effective. And particularly, I think the big lesson for Washington is that, hey, I got good people underneath me, and I need to listen to them because, as it turns out, they were right. And this proves that the revolution can succeed militarily, all because of one bold gamble, one night of labor, and a hill that overlooks Boston Harbor. And as the British sail away, many of them gather, many of the loyalists especially, gather on the decks of the ships, and someone says, "We'll be back soon." But George Irving, who was one of the loyalists, turns to the rest of them and says, "Gentlemen, not one of you will ever see this place again." The Americans have their first victory.
So, Dave, if I understand this, was this battle, we will call it, done without a shot being fired, just strategic wins here pretty much? Is that a strategy making this all happen?
No shots are fired after Dorchester Heights are occupied. Now, obviously, in the process from the 2nd to the 5th of occupying the Heights, we were firing off guns just to distract people. But yeah, once Dorchester Heights is occupied on the 4th, 5th of March, there's no more shooting. It's done. Now, the British, of course, tried that attack, but it didn't go anywhere.
You think the silence was because they had been defeated without a shot being fired?
I think the British are stunned. The journals that we have from the British officers are just incredulous that A, the Americans could pull this off, and B, they're just appalled that General Howe is even considering charging up that hill. They realize what happened at Bunker Hill, and they do not want to do that again. This rabblement of farmers, shopkeepers has defeated the King's regulars. These aren't Hessians. These are the King's regulars. The American Revolution has survived its infancy. The theater of war now will shift south to New York. And while things will ebb and flow, as wars often do, we've proven we can win. We've proven we have the staff, we have the people, we have the soldiers to do it. And that is the kind of thing that you need when you're taking on the world's biggest power.
That's just amazing to me. And to me, it's also like that example, as they were remembering Bunker Hill and how they're not going to repeat that, are the Brits now thinking of what they did at Dorchester Heights, what they did in Boston, as they consider what they're doing down the road in this war. And that's got to be inspiring to the patriots as they consider what's coming up.
It certainly helps grow the American Revolution. Of course, we're going to face some other problems. We've still got Valley Forge ahead of us. We've still got some other things ahead of us. But there's also a lot of recrimination on the British side, and yet no lessons learned. That's the amazing part. They still think that they're just going to waltz through this thing. They still think they're just going to march down to New York and smash the whole thing without any problems. They just don't
It's like
seem to
overlooking a weaker opponent the week before the playoffs, right?
Exactly. I mean,
and you end up losing.
All the problems haven't gone away. They still have the same supply problems, the same issues, but they just don't recognize it yet. But they will eventually.
The time is coming, and are we headed to New York next week, or are we going somewhere else?
No, we're going to look at the perfect villain next week. We're going to get back on the grievances, and we're going to talk some about those. We're going to talk about King George III. Why do we call him a tyrant?
Good idea. And we do it next Tuesday at 8 o'clock here with Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live.
The loyalists scrambled with 6 hours to spare, stuffing trunks and treasures, whatever they could bear. Carts and coaches rattled down the cobblestone street, while gangs and soldiers looted anything they could meet. Sugar in the harbor, tables smashed in two, chaos everywhere, but what else is new? 'Cause the ships were packed, the nerves were tight, and the rebels marched from every height. It's evacuation day, March 17, they sailed away, a crescent fleet on the open sea, leaving Boston town finally free. Oh, raise your voice and shout hooray, evacuation day. A crescent fleet on the open sea, leaving Boston town finally free. Whoa, raise your voice and shout hooray, the evacuation day. Washington waited, cautious and wise, sent immune troops in no smallpox surprise. They